Sorry. This is a meeting of the Stadium Authority Ad-Hoc Audit Committee, and I'm the Stadium Authority Chair, Lisa Gilmore, and we have Chair Member, Authority Member.
And Pat Kolstad.
So thank you. We're all here. We have our consent calendar. We have the minutes from March 19th, 2018. Do we have any discussion on that? Seeing none. All those in favor? Aye. That carries. Next, we have public presentations. If there's any member of the public that would like to speak, you can stand up from your seat or please come forward. Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to our general business, which is why we're all here, which is the status of the Harvey Rose and Associates audit recommendations.
Good evening.
Executive Director.
I'm going to start the presentation, and then I'm going to hand it over to our Finance Director to provide greater detail. But before I get started, I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce Ms. Lynn Lamb. She is our Santa Clara Stadium Authority Auditor, and she will be joining us for our upcoming meetings. We last met in March, and we're here again. We've talked about meeting semi-annually, perhaps quarterly if needed, and so we do want to review the results over the last 6 months. I have a quick PowerPoint. Today's conversation will cover the benefits of the audit, the summary of the audit recommendations, the outstanding or partially completed audit recommendations. We will present the net revenue from non-NFL events. Since the last report, the fourth quarter report that we've issued, we've had the opportunity to go back and look at the earlier fiscal year so that the council begins to build, the board begins to build on the context of non-NFL events, as well as just a brief update on possession of documents and the audit update. If you recall last time I talked about the methodology that we need to use. And then we are prepared to go through the review of the audit matrix in detail if that's what the committee would like to do. So the benefits of the audit, we believe that the work of the audit and the combined 37 recommendations have allowed for us to achieve greater transparency with respect to non-NFL events, understanding clearly the revenue and losses, as well as an improved budget document and better oversight for city staff or board staff to review, manage, and maintain oversight of the agreements. When we say better oversight of stadium operations, there has already been some improved outcomes. We have monthly meetings with the management company where we set our agendas and we cover our topics and we document our progress. The Stadium Authority staff did participate in last year's concessionaire contract, which the board did approve, as well as we've assisted with parking and concession audit. We also, with the information and the foundation of the audits, it did inform how we approached our college football playoff agreements, protecting the Stadium Authority, which in and of itself is Measure J compliance, as well as it produced transparent budget and marketing plans. In summary, what you will find is when we last reported in March, we had 18 of the audit recommendations complete. We now are showing 25 complete. That's a nearly 40% increase in completed audit recommendations, none of which are in the non-implemented status. They're all at the partially complete status. So from here, I'm going to walk the clicker over to Angie to complete the presentation. You got it, Walter? Thank you. So Angie will take the presentation.
She was
here.
doing so good. I thought she was going to do the whole thing.
Why don't I cover the next slide and then you can cover the details. So the audit recommendations are partially complete. Some are difficult to complete because they do require the consent from the management company or from the stadium company to amend the agreements that we have, which may take some time. As well as we plan on coming back in the March-April timeframe to stick with our 6-month schedule for reporting out on the audit recommendations. And from here, the next chart is for the outlook.
So this is the chart that we actually showed you in the last quarterly, the fourth quarter for the Stadium Authority, but we were able to actually add 2 additional fiscal years. So you can see we've circled what the average ticketed, per ticketed event goes to the general fund through performance rent. You can see for all 4 years, we've had significant losses in the non-NFL football category, which is the college and high school category. And then where the arrow is, you can see that's the performance rent that was paid each year to the general fund. So the high of the average general fund revenue is the about 185,000, which was in the first year of operations, 14-15, with a low being in 16-17 of about 46,000. But just like when we had presented this in the fourth quarter, concerts, soccer events, and special events such as weddings, corporate events, and birthday parties are positive revenue generators for the Stadium Authority, and those then go to the city's general fund through performance rent. Non-NFL football events, like I mentioned, college and high school, have generated substantial losses for all 4 years. And this helps us align, as our executive director mentioned, with the CFP, which saved the Stadium Authority from carrying an estimated $12 million loss. So we were able to use these financials to establish a separate agreement with them. So the possession of documents and audit update, we're still doing an independent review of the documentation, and the current review of this documentation has revealed some discrepancies. And we have contacted Manco about these discrepancies, and they have contacted me back, and so they are working on the additional information that I need to explain these differences, but I have not reviewed them yet. And as the executive director mentioned, we have filled the Stadium Authority auditor, and this provides in-house audit expertise, so I'm really happy to have Lynn on board to help us with this. She's already started reviewing our processes. She's went out to the Stadium Authority, met with Manco staff and Stadco staff, and actually sat down with them and watched some of the processes. And one of the items that she is also going to be working on is establishing audit procedures for our staff so that as we go out there, we know what to look at, what to check off. Right now, we're currently looking at every single invoice. So it'll be helpful to have, from an audit perspective, to have procedures that we can just follow. This is
I just wanted to
table.
comment. Yeah, so I wanted to pick up with our Stadium Authority auditor as we go into the next slide, because as we presented the last time, we come forward to the next slide.
Oh,
the complexity of of reviewing and auditing the possession of documents and what that means. And the slide may look familiar, but I did walk through the several events which you have on your table, as well as how we would have to verify the possession of documents and complete the audit. And so we had a methodology in place. We have an outside reviewer who's looking at the documents, and as we said, we've already identified discrepancies. But because Lynn is going to be working with us to establish pre-audit conditions so that going forward, we don't find ourselves in a place where we receive a large volume of possession of documents and cannot sort through them. It does allow for us to manage going forward with a pre-audit skill set. And she too will be reviewing those documents to validate them before we bring them to the board. And if we do get them sooner, before March or April, we'd be certain to see if the board would like to, or the committee would like to hear at a special meeting the results. If not, we're scheduled in the March-April timeframe. So suddenly, between an outside help, possession of documents, and an internal auditor who's going to be helping us establish a pre-audit environment for our work, this is now going to be a lot more simpler, and we've already determined where some discrepancies rest.
And Lynn's working on an audit work plan to bring back to the audit committee, and some of the stadium items will be included as part of her work plan. Her work plan's getting really big, just because we haven't had this expertise before for the city or the Stadium Authority, so she's got a lot that she's putting in place. So that completes our presentation, but we wanted to go through the matrix if you wanted to.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
before you go forward based upon that? I know we talked about getting real-time access to the documents in terms of access to the computers there to make sure that we can go in at any time. What's the status of that?
So we did have that conversation. The status is still open, and that in lieu of trying to achieve integrated systems and look at how the architecture of the financial systems is put together. We asked in the interim, could we have access, if they could download the information just to an Excel spreadsheet where we could counter that with the documents that we had in our possession. That's the work that's underway to review the ledger that has been provided to us by Excel against the documents in our possession. And that's where we've completed a couple of fiscal years, and any discrepancies, we're still validating those.
So going forward, it would make it a lot easier on the non-NFL events to be able to see in real time what's happening.
It's really a function on our side as well as just the capacity to understand the architecture of the systems and how to pull out the stadium authority information. And so it's still open, it's something that we're working on, but because we do have the Excel general ledger information, we started to work on that to answer the immediate question, which is up here.
Right.
And we're trying to become really familiar with their reports, similar to when we run a PeopleSoft report and give it to someone else. Their system is a little different too, so we're trying to really understand the work papers that we're getting. So, and that's one thing too that Lynn was able to do is actually, I think with the shared expenses you went through.
Yes, I had a chance, actually went to the stadium authority, so I did kind of review the business process for the shared expense and then the non-NFL expense as well. So part of the goal is, at least internally within the stadium authority for staff, is to kind of understand the business process and document the business process and then develop audit procedures for it. So at a level where we're comfortable with where we're at in terms of expenses that we're auditing.
Well, you've all made a tremendous amount of progress so far, a tremendous amount, so so thank you for that. Are there questions before they move forward from anyone? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
So if we would turn to, it looks like the page 1 of the matrix, I just wanted to kind of give an overview. The items in orange are ones that are partially complete, so there's 12 of those. The gray were complete in the last meeting, so you've already seen those. We've already went over those. And then the green color are the new completed ones since March. So I didn't know how, I know last time you kind of wanted to walk through and just kind of had some questions on each one. So I didn't know if you wanted to do that or how you want to walk through those. I'd be happy to do whatever you.
Let's just walk.
Okay.
We can just walk through them.
We can just walk.
I think it's easier.
Okay, so the 1A is the public cost, safety cost threshold. And so we've had meetings on this, and I don't know if maybe the city attorney would like to talk a little bit more on this, but we have had meetings. We're trying to engage in good faith negotiations on this, and it's still in process, I think.
Well, as you might recall, there's the threshold only applies to the first 3 years, but after the first 3 years, we have the right to request a change in the threshold, and that process has begun. It took a long time because we triggered it well over 1.5 years ago, and not much progress was made until I'd say maybe this summer we started really working hard on it. The big issue is what do we do about the recently completed season where we have already exceeded the threshold for this year, and we haven't had an agreement about who pays for that. They demanded money from us, and we have not paid it. So the failure to resolve the issue is at this point in the stadium authority and the city's favor because we haven't paid them the money they're asked for. So for this year, the issue remains unresolved. We did have some discussion about future years, about them reviewing the budget for public safety expenses, and we're currently in discussions about the current year as well. And we plan on, in view of the fact that they have not responded to our proposals, we simply plan on telling them that this is how we intend to proceed for the current year in terms of how we're going to pay for the public safety costs and what we'll expect them to pay. So we'll see. They have not really responded to our last proposal.
And this is just public safety costs for their football games, not
This
for
is
the
just
non-NFL.
NFL public safety costs.
For their football games. Their
Right.
10 games.
Right. The threshold
Yeah.
only applies to the NFL side. The non-NFL side, it's a totally different issue.
Actual costs.
It's actual costs, yes. All costs are paid for by the stadium authority. The city, in no case does the city pay for the NFL or the non-NFL public safety costs. That we've made sure.
Okay, so meetings are ongoing and
And we're
stay tuned.
awaiting
Okay.
their response, yeah.
Okay,
We're hoping
Thank
to
you.
say completed next time.
yes, we hope
In
so.
March. So we'll go to 1F.
I
Oh,
just want
sorry.
to ask a
Authority
question on
member
that, a point of clarity. So on that, so the costs are incurred basically by the city in providing the public safety. And so right now, the expense is sitting with the stadium authority. So when if I'm following correctly, so when we're saying that, we haven't agreed that the city's going to pay for it, so at this point, is it that the cost is really still sitting with the stadium authority, and so perhaps we're not making the stadium authority whole? Is that, if I'm following?
No, do you mind, go ahead. So we bill Stadco, and they pay the full amount. So now they're asking for a refund, basically, of that amount that we've overpaid, or that they've overpaid. So they pay the full. So the city and the stadium authority are not out that money right now.
Okay, so it came from Stadco funds, not from stadium authority funds?
Correct.
Okay, great, all right, thank you.
That's a good question. Okay.
Okay, so if we move on to 1F. The Stadium Authority Board should direct the Executive Director to notify Stadco that a formal consolidated draft parking plan must be produced and delivered to the Community Development Department. And this is something that we believe is in our side right now, so we agree with it, and we need to determine a way to get the existing permit applications and modifications to the stadium manager. So in order for him to complete a consolidated parking plan. So it's on the staff. We're working on that to get that to him so that then he can make the plan. So I think there's a disconnect, right? I mean, I'm not as up to date on exactly how the plan works, but I know that there's pieces that the stadium manager doesn't have that we have. So we need to give him the full amount. Any questions on that?
So this is the overall parking plan for all of the events?
Correct.
Every event, right?
Correct.
And so did they provide it originally?
So
I don't really understand.
So
the
they can't
action
provide it
taken.
because they're the outside lots. They don't have that information because those vendors contract directly with the city, not with the stadium manager. So he doesn't have oversight on those lots. So we need to work together to come up with that plan.
So we know where those outside lots are because we charge permit fees for
Correct.
those outside lots. But it's my understanding that a parking plan is the overall parking plan, or am I
And the
not
parking plan
understanding
is
this
included
correctly?
in the parking that's offered as through management company and stadium company, as well as the city's privately permitted parking lots. And that's the information. It changes, and some of the parking plan has changed over time. So we need to make sure that they have current information with any parking changes that may have been made, as well as we have current information with those private parking, private permitted parking, and then go from there. And so that's all underway. But I think what's very telling is if we do assessments with respect to parking impacts, with the city, we need to do some work on our end with respect to the permitted parking
Right.
lots.
Authority member?
Yes, so I guess my understanding is, and I think we did see some documentation where they're going to be submitting, okay, say for Taylor Swift, we're going to use, and I forget, red, blue, yellow, but the lots at Great America, we're going to use the lot at Mission College, we're not using, obviously, the golf course anymore, but, so we're getting better communication as to which lots they will need, including the ones that the city has permitted, whether it's the private property owner. So they're working more closely with us and telling us which lots they will require based on the estimate of the scope of the event.
They provide that information already. What we need to do is also then work together to look at what the city's privately permitting as well as what they're providing, and then have the more global review to get to what the mayor is saying in terms of the larger parking program.
Right, because one of my concerns is that, you know, what we call the Yahoo property has now been sold a couple of times, and, you know, we're not sure, but I mean, so, but the, you know, the Kylie project, you know, some form of that project is probably going to take all of that land. And I mean, that's a major part, you know, so that's one of the things I've kind of been worried about and mentioned it a couple times, you know, like, you know, what is going to be the plan for, you know, a couple of years from now when that property is probably under construction.
You raise an excellent point, and I feel a little bit silly saying that, you know, we haven't, something that seems so easy about the private permitting as well as their offered parking program is somewhat delayed, and that is because we have been working on the sequencing of the larger global parking issue with respect to city place development and how we would sequence over time. And so we've had to layer that on and absorb that extra workload, and so that's been how we've prioritized. But we have been over even the last week and a half in greater levels of discussion with respect to our privately permitted parking lots and their parking program.
And I think that we might have a little bit of time before all these developments take place and we lose all that parking. I think we're just trying to say, you know, we need to keep it on the radar, as you already know, that it's going to be an issue for us in the next year or two, and there needs to be parking.
What I can do in the early year 2019 is just bring back a parking plan report for the whole board to understand, since we will have some new council members, and the complexity of parking and sequencing in that area.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
I don't know, did you want to also go over the completed ones, or do you want to just talk about the partially complete?
I'd go over the completed ones.
Okay.
Just so we know, since we haven't met, just quickly, yeah.
Yeah, so 1G is the public safety plan, and we do have that in our possession. It's something that we would like to keep under lock and key, but any of the board members are welcome to actually view that. It's in the executive director's possession. Is there any questions on that one?
No?
1H is the Stadium Authority Board should direct the executive director to formally notify STADCO that the cost for stadium insurance must be disclosed in the shared stadium expenses. So in the stadium lease, section 8.3.1, it states that the Stadium Authority insurance share shall be calculated as follows, and it gives us the calculation where it starts at the first year shall equal $2,550,000, and then increases by 3% each year. So this is a fixed rate for insurance, and it was included in the facility rent arbitration calculation as part of Exhibit J, and it was confirmed as part of the rent arbitration award. So we are not recommending amending the management agreement on this one.
Okay.
So 1I, the Stadium Authority Board should direct the executive director to formally notify STADCO and MANCO that MANCO is in breach of the management agreement because it did not furnish the annual statements of stadium operations for the 3 years. Actually, it's 4 years. They have not done this. So it's the management agreement and the amended and restated stadium lease provide conflicting language on this item. So we're working through that. I underlined in the actual action taken where there is a discrepancy. It's, you know, I think it's the management agreement says that the certified public accountant should be selected by STADCO and approved by us, the Stadium Authority, while the lease says that it would be selected by us, the landlord, and approved. So there's conflicting language on who gets to select this certified public accountant, but we do agree that an outside auditor should prepare this.
Okay.
And we'll be working on how to rectify that. So 1M is also one that was completed. The Stadium Authority Board should direct the executive director to confer with the finance director treasurer to determine what financial information would be necessary to assess non-NFL event financial performance. And as you saw today and in the fourth quarter report, we are presenting that information now. So we are able to actually look at our finance reports and really tell where we're having our losses and where we're having our gains. So we consider that one complete. A long time coming, but complete.
Right,
So.
thank you. 5 years, yeah.
On one end, this one is partially complete, and it's that the board should direct the executive director to notify Manco that it is in breach of the management agreement, section 3.3, which requires that written revenue or other reports relating to non-NFL events be provided to the stadium authority within 45 days of non-NFL events with attendance exceeding 25,000. Section 3.3 of the management agreement states exactly that, and we on October 1st, staff requested in writing that this information be provided to the executive director. And let's see, I believe we gave them a timeline, right? So we gave them a week, and it has not yet been complied with. So,
Have they ever submitted a report?
not that I'm aware, the executive director may.
The letters are included in the packet, and they did submit one report after we had been talking about it for several months. I'm not certain if this is the letter, but I did send it back to them, speaking to the deficiencies of how they reported out the information to comply with 3.3. And so what we have begun to do over the last couple of weeks, or maybe about 6 to 8 weeks, is for each of the events, remind them that they're due, the information is due, and what date they're due, so that they can submit the information. However, I can confirm that for the Beyonce Jay-Z concert, we still have not received that information, and it's past the required timeline in the agreement. And we did receive a revised version of their report out in compliance with the first part of 3.3, and we're in process of pushing that back to it's still deficient.
So had we been receiving these reports, we would have seen some of the events were huge money losers for the Stadium Authority, and maybe we could have taken action sooner on some of these. Is it supposed to be a financial report within 45 days of each non-NFL event?
Well, there's two requirements in 3.3, and the language isn't explicit here. I'll look in the attachment to see if it's included. There's two components of management agreement 3.3. The first is that requires, and the language used in the provision is without limitation, that there is access to, for myself, the executive director, to events that they are entertaining getting into contract. So I believe that from that language, and in the business interest of understanding financials, that's the intent, is to understand what the possibility is going into contract without limitation, understanding the details, which inherently are the financial details of an event, and then following up then how the event performed. So there is a complete life cycle in that management 3.3 of pre-contract to after event.
So before and after the event.
And we're struggling to get information, as we
Well,
mentioned.
and some decisions could have been made through the marketing plan, although they never did a marketing plan, but other ways that we would have had a better understanding of how these events are performing, which we're just starting to get a look now. All right.
In our letter that you have a copy of, we did actually tell them what we want, because it does say in the agreement that the executive director could say what she wanted to see. And one of the items is a profit and loss statement revealing all the revenues. And then also statistical event data, such as number of tickets sold, that type of. So it is both a financial and an informative.
There's another letter that's not in your packet that was sent about the first part that I believe I sent to the board.
We're attaching that letter to our November report. The other letter is being attached to the November report to the board.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
1.0, the Stadium Authority Board should direct the Executive Director and Stadium Authority Council to request an amendment to the management agreement that would require formal and/or informal bidding procedures for any transaction with Manco. This isn't one of the ones we mentioned earlier in that it's, we need the consent with Manco and Stadco to actually change the management agreement. So this is one that we'll have to work on. It may take a while. As we say on here, it must be a mutual agreement between both parties to amend the management agreement. We do have, as you know, stadium policies and procedures in our code, but this one hasn't actually, when we read it, hasn't really been followed completely, I don't think, because it says the stadium procurement contracts entered into with agreements amounts greater than 100,000 within 30 days of entering into such agreement, and I'm not sure that the Stadium Authority has been notified of that because they've been following, I think, the 250,000 that's actually in the code.
The requirement is that after 30 days for contracts over 100,000, they're supposed to disclose those, but they do have procurement authority up to 250,000 or above, 250, and then they need to come to the board. So
Are they disclosing the contracts over 100,000?
no, they are not, and we're going to be following up on this item.
Yeah, we'll be sending, we put it in here, but we will be sending out a letter asking for, or requesting compliance with that. So 1P is also a partially complete.
I want to go back to
Okay.
1.0 because I do think it is significant in that in our efforts to implement this audit recommendation, the city attorney worked with the FPPC to get an opinion about whether the stadium manager should be completing Statement of Economic Interest Form 700s, and the opinion confirmed that the stadium manager should be filing Form 700s, and I think that was significant.
I think he did file a Form 700.
And the Stadium Authority amended its conflict of interest code to require that. So it's filed with the city clerk. It's
Did you say they filed a conflict of interest statement as well?
no, that's the Form 700
Oh, I thought
disclosure.
in addition to that.
No, financial disclosure form, Form 700. It's something that should have been done from the very beginning of the Stadium Authority, that there should have been an amendment to the conflict of interest code. So that's something that's now been cleared up.
Thank you.
Moving to 1P, and this is also related to parking. It's that the board should direct the executive director to direct Manco to provide quarterly written reports to the Stadium Authority to be maintained as permanent Stadium Authority records, detailed parking lot information as required in the First Amendment. And again, we have on October 18th, we requested, the executive director requested in writing that the stadium manager begin providing this in their written quarterly reports detailing parking lot information as required by the management agreement. And I don't know that we've had a meeting since I don't think we have since the letter went out, so we'll be able to update the committee.
Okay.
So 2A, the stadium board should request that Manco provide the relevant reports and documentation that back up the NFL ticket surcharge summary reports in order to retain permanent verification of the accuracy of the surcharge calculated by Manco. And again, a letter was sent to Manco on October 9th to provide these reports, and Stadco responded that they had received my letter, and they notified us that they were in the process of providing the requested documentation, but we have not yet received it.
Okay.
We have sat with them and went through the process, but we want to be able to actually have third-party verification, so. 2B, the Stadium Authority Board should negotiate with Manco to establish a level of detail regarding non-NFL event revenue and expenses that can be provided in city reports, public documents, and permanent records. Again, this is similar to the one earlier, as we did tonight in the fourth quarter report. We are actually getting this information and being able to provide it to the board and the public. 2D, the Stadium Authority Board should require that Manco provide reports and documentation that can be kept in Stadium Authority records consistent with confidentiality provisions in the agreements that back up the non-NFL ticket surcharge summary report. And this is when we're talking about the documents that we've received. We are currently reviewing that. The review is currently underway for completeness of those documents. 2I, the stadium authority should require that Manco provide independently prepared reports and documentation to back up the number of NFL tickets sold for the fiscal year in order to verify the senior youth fee. And this is similar to the surcharge, and the same applies. The letter was sent on the 9th, and Stadco has responded that they are going to provide that information, but I've not seen it yet. And 2K, the Stadium Authority Board should direct staff to prepare policies and procedures pertaining to all purchases made on behalf of the Stadium Authority to require a level of specificity in costs and services in all vendor contracts. So we do have a policy in place, but I think as we said in the code, we've also recently hired a contracts manager, which is going to, I'm really happy about having a procurement manager, purchasing manager, and now I also have a contracts manager that will be helpful in this. Because what this is actually talking about is actually the city side. So what happens is the city sometimes will purchase copier costs or supplies for the city, but the Stadium Authority also uses those supplies. So those are the agreements that the auditors were talking about, were city contracts. So we need to have better oversight on our side to make sure that those. We're also going to make sure that accounts payable takes a greater role. I think in the past, they were a little lax thinking the city auditor's office was looking, or the city clerk, city auditor was looking at those, and they were not looking at those for discrepancies. So accounts payable staff is actually going to take a greater role in there.
Good. Okay.
3A, the Stadium Authority Board should request that staff prepare plans for reimbursement for the city's general fund for unreimbursed staff costs from the appropriate source, discretionary fund, Manco, or the extent the funds are available and appropriate, the construction fund. And the city staff did self-correct. We were able to validate from the Harvey Rose audit approximately $12,000. We are actually, now that Lynn is on board, going to actually have her review, because it's actually an internal, we're auditing ourselves, so it falls well with Lynn's expertise to actually look at what we did and see if those entries are correct and actually follow the flow.
Okay, thank you. So it's mentioned in here about the construction fund. I know some of us have had some issues with that for a few years. Have we been able to really get, did we ever, or are we going to do an audit of the construction fund in terms of even the, I mean, it seems like kind of water over the bridge now, but in terms of the costs associated with the construction of the stadium, and I believe that there was a certain amount of, fairly substantial amount of money that was left in that fund, and how that fund maybe has been used, or what's the status of that fund?
In our March report that we presented earlier, we acknowledged that the city, it would be inappropriate for city or board staff to audit our own work that we created, and the committee accepted the report. But we do have Lynn on board. Her workload is getting very heavy, as you can see, who can work with, we have already an outside reviewer that's working with us on the possession of document information. Once that effort is complete, we can move into the construction fund and better understand what happened in those earlier years.
Okay, great, thank you. Just wanted to make sure we didn't lose sight of that.
No, we don't want to lose sight of the construction fund, because it looked like that fund was used for a lot of things, including enormous public safety costs and other things.
So we can add that to the work plan, and that we'll present, or the auditor will present in January. Mm-hmm. But it is something that we wanted to sequence out after we complete the work on the screen ahead.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Moving to 3C, the Stadium Authority Board should direct staff to develop specific definitions of which costs should be charged as overhead and which should be direct billed. Currently, we're using a 10% rate, but we are in the process of hiring a consultant to prepare our cost allocation plan, and one of those would be to calculate the accurate overhead that would be used for this. So we will have a third party looking at that and coming up with a cost for us. Moving to 4A, the Stadium Authority Board should exercise its rights stipulated in an agreement between Master Parking Lot Operator City Park and Manco to periodically audit the detailed records of the parking lots for NFL and non-NFL events. And as we mentioned in the presentation, myself and the principal accountant for the stadium actually attended the audit of the parking and the concession and merchandise for the non-NFL event side. And so we have received a copy of the actual report, but we're waiting on the responses from the vendors because there were certain findings. I've been told by Manco that we now have that in our possession at the Stadium Authority office, so I need to go out there and actually review it. So I'll be interested to see on some of them what their responses were. It's similar to when we do our audit. We always have an audit recommendation, and then we either agree with it and say why, and what we've done to correct it. I think the one with the concessionaire will be, it was when Center Plate was there, so it's a little harder because now it's Levy, so I guess maybe that was the corrective action at the time, so. 4B, the Stadium Authority Board should direct staff to report back on the advantages and disadvantages of adding city audit rights as conditions of granting our parking permits, and we totally agree with this and have added it to the language as a condition on our parking permit, so it is now on the actual permit. So, the 4C is the last one, and it says the Stadium Authority Board should direct staff to require that Manco provide a written report on matters related to off-site parking operations at their quarterly meetings. And again, as we mentioned earlier, a letter was sent to them on October 18th requesting this information going forward, and should be presented at the next meeting on November 29th. And we'll report out on that in the March-April timeframe. And with that, I think we went over them. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions? Any questions? T? Pat? Good, excellent report, thank you.
Thank you. 12 more, and hopefully in March, April, we can say it is complete and we put all the processes into place. Hopefully.
Also, there was a certain amount of money that was owed to the city for, I know, ongoing parking lot issues and their legal issues. And
the golf
I
course?
know it's
Are you
in
talking
litigation.
about the golf
yeah,
course?
Right. So we don't talk about it, I guess, since that's not on our agenda. Those other items. Okay, thank you. Staff, do you have anything else?
I want to acknowledge if there isn't any questions or more work from the committee. I did want to acknowledge the significance of this work. When I first started, we didn't have an organization or structure in terms of how to approach providing audit recommendations and supporting them. With the City Council and the board support, we were able to hire Catlin Ivanetich, who has provided great monitoring and oversight of the agreements, and internally the Department of Finance as well as Walter have put together these matrices and really maintained monitoring, and we now, a year later, have an auditor on board, and she's producing reports and making findings and establishing pre-audit conditions. We've made significant progress over the last year, and I wanted to acknowledge your support of it because I think the outcome is very well demonstrated in the quality of work that you're receiving.
I 100% agree. I mean, when we started this committee and we were talking to an auditor to even do this, we had even no direction to our city employees as to how they should bill. I mean, that's how, loose the management was in terms of the stadium and the stadium authority. So we've made progress by leaps and bounds, and we really appreciate it. It's very technical and it's very complex, the whole stadium authority situation. So just understanding it in the first place and trying to manage the finances of it, along with all the challenges that we've had with our tenant, this is really tremendous. So I'm feeling a great amount of hope for the future that we're going to get this managed properly the way it should have been on day one. So thank you all for your very important role in the committee's role also is to giving direction on getting this done. So I think, and the public thanks you as well, all of you. Thank you. So if you're finished with your report, I'll ask if there's any member of the public has any questions on that report. Please feel free to come forward or comments. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. Did I hear that the general ledger, I guess from Manco or Sadco, was in an Excel spreadsheet format? And then I was wondering, how is that integrated into our accounting database? And then are the receipts and invoices in electronic formats, or are they in paper? Because that makes it hard to do a audit test. And then the other question I had was that how are we allocating the costs to NFL and non-NFL events for putting aside reserves to update the seats and the structure so that we don't get in a mess like the convention center where no money was set aside for updates and repairs?
All right, thank you. We'll get those. Maybe we'll take a list of all the questions and then attempt to answer them at the end. Anyone, other questions? Okay, seeing none, then Angie or
So
City
I will,
Executive Director.
I will have our finance director or treasurer respond to the last. We have possession on an Excel spreadsheet of the fiscal transactions that have been completed by the management company. We manage and use that information within the office at the Levi Stadium, so we don't commingle with our accounting systems, largely because we're still very much reviewing that information and validating it based on our chart above in terms of analyzing and comparing. Our documents, we have some actual paper documents, which proved to be a very difficult process for our management company to produce the paper documents in high-quality copy form. We shifted to PDFs, but then we requested that the PDFs be searchable PDFs so that we can look at, before we just got the static PDFs, almost like a picture of a document, and we wanted search capability, and so we now have search capability of the PDF documents. What we're finding is that we are still missing some documents, but reviewing that against the spreadsheet that we have allows for us to isolate which documents we're missing and work with the management company to receive those documents. Very, very rigorous work, and what we are doing is we're doing a document review. I understand that you use the term audit testing, but we're actually looking at the review of documents so that we understand how the figures build up to the larger reporting that we've been doing on an annual basis. So it's taken a little bit more time from that perspective. I think I answered the first two. You were going to answer the last.
On the reserves are actually set by agreement, so we have to have certain caps each year. So we have a general reserve that we fill, I kind of call it buckets, and then there is a certain reserve limit for the capital, and I believe the debt also. So there's just certain buckets that we fill per the agreements, and they're in our budget. If you want to see them, and you can contact me. I can help you, but I don't have that in front of me right now. But we do follow the agreements on those, and for exactly that reason, especially the capital reserve is to cover these costs that we think. And then once all the debt is paid, there's another reserve that'll be the demolition reserve that we actually have to start funding. So once all the debt is paid off, then it'll start going into that reserve bucket.
I just want to add that in the budget that was approved in March 2018, earlier this year, we did provide a line-by-line item as an attachment of the capital investments and the use of funds for the planned budget year. So we are providing more transparency around areas of improvement from a capital project perspective.
I also wanted to add that, on this issue of the reserves and the buckets and the waterfall out of the buckets, the fact that the arbitration was resolved in the way that it was, that it not only preserved what we had originally set as the rent as 24.5. It increased that rent, and that additional rent allows us to fill, first of all, pay the debt off quicker. It allows the buckets and the various reserve buckets to be filled more quickly, and then even at the end, if all those buckets are filled and we have adequate reserves, then there's even a possibility of some transfer of that money into the general fund. So it can't be lost that the arbitration victory was very significant, especially in the area of protecting the city from exactly what you were talking about in terms of the city of Oakland being stuck with debt and an inability to have reserves to deal with their stadium.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get my question answered. My question was, how do we allocate putting into this bucket of reserves between NFL and non-NFL? Let's say we have a ton of concerts, and every concert degrades the facility partially. So you would think that we would charge more of the reserve bucket from all those concerts that are happening rather than NFL events. So how do we allocate between the two in terms of putting aside those reserves every year?
So we don't break it out by NFL, non-NFL. We break it out stadium-wide. Obviously, the Stadco has their TIs, tenant improvements, where they have to set aside their bucket of reserves to fix the suites and things like that. But the whole stadium is the stadium authority owns the whole stadium. So those buckets are actually for the entire stadium to fix it. So we don't go through and say, at the NFL game, probably tear up something more than others, or concerts. We don't break it out that way.
And I'd just like to add that the lease really does provide for how these reserves are filled. And I think that the basic premise was that since this stadium was built principally for an NFL use, that the reserve should come mostly from the NFL, primarily and only if there was never understood how much money the non-NFL side of the lease would actually make. So I think they wanted to make sure that the reserves were adequately funded just through the NFL revenue and the rent.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a good point, because one of the largest revenue sources is through the rent for the stadium authority, and so you could say that a large portion of that is NFL.
Okay. Thank you for that. Seeing no other, we have
a follow-on question about reserves. I understand that you're filling the reserves per the documents, but is there a process to analyze the adequacy of reserves, the way you would with a townhome reserve process, just periodically?
I don't think that I've done an analytical but I believe that our debt is being paid off so quickly, and the stadium is doing very well. When you look, and again, like we mentioned, that we won the rent arbitration, so that's very successful for us. We're bringing in large amount of revenue. We have expenses, but we're also paying the debt down really quite quickly, which I think is a really good indication of how positive the stadium has been. The buckets that, I think for the general account, just the regular stadium authority account, I'm trying to think, it's over 10 million, maybe $11 million.
Before you start to guesstimate,
okay.
I'm going to request, that's a great question, and we can answer through the city manager's blog. There is, the agreements do articulate the level of reserve and the investment in the reserves, and it's, I think it would be to our mutual or collective benefit to answer that through the city manager's blog or through an information memo at the next Stadium Authority Board meeting, where we can itemize the agreement term, what it requires, and then we can also provide transparency around the level of reserves put away in each of the provisions of the agreement.
Yeah, we could do a percentage, calculate the percentage based on what the overall expenses are.
But during the stadium negotiations, there was a lot of discussions on what the capital expenditures were going to be over the term of the lease, and there were provisions made to make sure that those capital expenditures would be funded and that the stadium was continuously updated in terms of the capital expenditure. So that was studied very, very closely during the negotiation. So city manager will, our stadium authority director will follow up on that, but it was a big consideration during the development of the stadium.
We are in budget development. We're beginning our budget development for the March presentation. So we will, as we develop the budget, we will work with Manco and through our shared expenses in the budget to think through how we can be more transparent on these areas so that we move and evolve from our capital detail for investments into reserves.
Yeah, that's really important because we wanted to make sure during the time period that the issues were taken care of, the reserves were fully funded so that we could make those improvements going on. So at the end of the, the middle of the term, when you get to year 25-30, when all the issues start happening, that we were going to be able to financially cover those capital expenditures. Teresa?
Okay. Thinking about that, because, I think we all saw kind of at Candlestick Park, even though now people are very nostalgic for it, but during its latter years, I mean, that was one of the complaints from the 49ers, as I recall, was that the stadium wasn't being maintained as well. Are there like industry standards or something about, that apply to a building such as this as to, how much you should have in reserves? Or are we just kind of working on what we think, looking at what the lifespan of some of the different components of the stadium are?
This is, let me just, again, go back to the lease. The lease is a 40-year lease, and we have the virtue, unlike Candlestick or the Oakland Coliseum, we have the virtue of knowing that our rent is going to be almost $25 million a year. That's guaranteed. As long as they play in that stadium, that's how much they have to pay. So, and we can see that the debt is going down at a much faster rate than we thought, which means that the anticipated reserves that we would need to take care of exactly the situation that you're talking about look very, very favorable to happen, that we will have these reserves within the Stadium Authority budget set aside. And of course, the 49ers are going to want a nice stadium 20 years from now. So if there's capital expenditures that are needed, and they're paying the rent, I mean, that's the rent's coming out of their pocket, and so they have just as much incentive to keep that stadium in a condition where people are going to pay the ticket prices and watch the football team there as anyone else. So I think, although we can't predict, what will happen 20, 25 years from now, I think we're in about as good a shape as you can imagine in terms of having a very good financial forecast for being able to pay into those reserves and have those reserves available even 20 years from now, because we know that the income is fixed at almost $25 million a year.
Thank you. Okay, Pat.
Move to note and file.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you. Any other staff reports here? Commissioner report? I want to thank Authority Member Kolstad, since this will be his last meeting, unless we could always call a special meeting between now and December. I would really like to do that, but...
I bet you would.
But thank you, Authority Member Kolstad, for all your work and help and support on the audit committee here. We did some good work together, and you were a big part of it, so thank you. Thank you. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.